Welcome to TechLeader TV. I'm your host, John Thomas Flynn, and this program today is our 100th production, dating back to 2006, when CIO Clark Kelso graced our studio stage for our first show. And in that tradition, we continue with a stellar lineup of topics and guests, a live streaming video webcast and cable television program focusing on public sector information technology and the political landscape. We come to you today courtesy of our sponsors, Veeam, Gigaman, Advanced Onion, IP Solutions, LexisNexis, Carahsoft, and our newest sponsor, Akamai, featuring the world's largest and most trusted cloud delivery platform. And thanks for watching. The TechLeader TV website continues to set new audience records. We're reaching thousands of state IT decision makers and vendor partners who recorded 250,000 page views last month alone, 250,000. We recorded over 2.5 million views in 2017, a new record, and we expect new traffic records in 2018 as well. And we have a very special program today with our guest, Adam Dondro, Agency Information Officer for the State of California Health and Human Services Agency. As our longtime viewers of TechLeader TV know, before I introduce my guest and we begin our conversation, I request your indulgence to allow me to pontificate on pressing issues of the day. Or at least in this case, where do the agency information officers come from? Our viewers know that I have a special interest in what I call the CIO governance model, how state CIO organizations are organized and how they manage the state IT resources and investments. Remember, the state of California has 10,000 IT employees, 10,000. My introduction to this issue occurred when I became the first Chief Information Officer for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the early 1990s. At the time of my appointment by Governor Bill Weld, I had been following the career of Rouse Saigenda, who was one of the first star CIOs in the United States. He was the CIO of Texas Instruments, Bell Atlantic, and then he took on perhaps the largest IT job in America as the first CIO of General Motors. You might know that in the early 1990s, there were no state CIOs. As CIO in Massachusetts, I was arguably the first state CIO in the country. As GM CIO Saigenda had appointed CIOs in every division in GM who reported directly to him, I adopted the same model in Massachusetts and then in California when I became the Golden State's first CIO in 1995. And while I was never able to achieve the reporting authority over agency CIOs that I desired, the model was implemented and continues to this day. And I think you'll agree that the model has a pretty good pedigree and has been adopted across the country. As a result, we have our guest today is HHS's CIO, or Agency Information Officers. I thought you might like a little history of the CIO governance model, and then a discussion with Adam about just how this is working, plus all the other enormous issues an agency like HHS is challenged with every day. As usual on TechLeader TV, we're going to continue to do our best to keep the spotlight on the state's management of its annual multi-billion-dollar IT investment, whatever it really is, to make government more efficient, more effective, and more secure. And hopefully we'll have a little fun and keep your interest at the same time. Our motto is simple. As I like to say, California can always do better. Let's begin the journey now with our discussion on technology, government, politics, and as I like to say, our other unnatural acts. I'll be right back with our guests in just a moment, and we'll begin. Hi, welcome back to TechLeader TV. As I mentioned, our guest is Adam Dondro, who was appointed by Governor Jerry Brown in July of 2017, just a little less than a year ago, as the Agency Information Officer at the California Health and Human Services Agency. He oversees the information technology and security policies at over a dozen HHS departments that provide a range of healthcare-related services, social services, mental health services, hospital services, income assistance, and public health services to Californians. HHS has more than 33,000 employees, 33,000. It's one of the largest in state government. Not to compare with the Department of Corrections, it has 60,000, but that's a story for another day, isn't it? It also has a budget of about $140 billion if you look at all the funds, state, bonds, special funds, and federal funds. $140 billion, much of that in Medicare, or Medi-Cal as we call it in California. Has an IT budget of over $2 billion, and as I said before, is one of the largest agencies in state government outside of corrections, DOT, and I believe, what's the other big one? K through 12, right? You've worked in, your background, you worked in social services, you worked at the California Department of Technology, where we probably first met, and also worked in the Assembly, and I know you mentioned it in chatting just about with Governor Davis.
Yeah.
So, Adam, welcome to TechLeader TV. We're glad to have you.
Thank you, glad to be here.
And congratulations on your appointment. You've been there almost a year. Tell us a little bit about your background. When we met, I think you were a public information officer.
Sure. Yeah, I've held quite a few different roles over the years. Started at the legislature and thought I was going to be an expert in renewable energy. And I learned pretty quickly working in the legislature that I actually really had a passion for government in general. How do we as a government provide for the needs of the citizens? I believe very strongly in the role of government in America. And I had the opportunity working in the Assembly to look at that kind of across the spectrum. And I quickly learned that that's really where I had a passion. And never imagined it was going to lead down a road of information technology and those sorts of things. But when I had a unique opportunity under Terry Takai to move over to then the OCIO, now California Department of Technology, it really seemed like a perfect fit for what I cared about, because really that's what IT is all about. It's about how do we serve the needs of Californians.
How did you go, though, from the information officer roles and responsibilities into IT?
Sure. So when I went to the Department of Technology, it was to do legislative affairs and then external affairs. And over the course of that time frame, we had Terry Takai, Christy Quinlan for a good period of time, acting in interim, and then Carlos. And over that time, what my role in external affairs was ranged in terms of what I was doing: public information officer, handling policy issues, for most of that time handling strategy around the whole state's view of IT and what we wanted to do. I got a call from Department of Social Services one day that said, we have an opportunity that we think you'd be good for, called horizontal integration. And everyone, including me, said, What's is that? But really what it came down to in Health and Human Services, as in elsewhere in government, things have really functioned in silos for a long time. How do we get CalFresh benefits out to those who need food assistance? How do we get health coverage to those who need health, right? And you deal with those independently, when in reality, across Health and Human Services, it's mostly the same clientele who are needing 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 of these services. But they fill out separate applications for each of those, go to a different office for each of those. So the idea around horizontal integration was both from an IT and a business perspective. How do you shift that focus from the government program to the user on the other end of it? And say, how do I meet all of their needs? How do I get this individual back on their feet and meet the needs that they have? And that was really what that job focused on. And under the leadership of Will Lightbourne and Pete Chervinka at Department of Social Services, they gave me the bandwidth to do that.
Okay.
And so it was this opportunity to work in IT and business, and that's really what led me down this
That's
path.
a fascinating area, because that's something that certainly I faced when I was working in government. The difficulty of having one-stop shopping, as we called it sometimes, for benefits was a difficult one.
Very.
And interestingly enough, when I was at NASCIO just recently, I chatted with another former president there, and we were talking about the challenge of working with the federal government, because a lot of times, you know, in one hand they got the bucks, the other hand they've got their rules and regulations that can really stymie things. And I bet you ran into that when you were looking at trying to make that horizontal integration across different silos, if you will. Sometimes the feds are very tough about allowing you to do that. I remember it used to be people would have 2 or 3 different PCs on their desk because they weren't allowed to mix and match.
Yeah.
I mean, and I've heard that's still somewhat of a problem.
It is still a problem. The feds have come a long way, just like the state has, in terms of how we look at these things. So they're starting to have more cross-departmental discussions at the federal level. They're at the very early phases of starting to talk about how we fund things and recognizing that the way you fund something really drives, possibly more than policy, the way that that's going to get implemented. So if you are going to have a dedicated funding stream, people are going to build a dedicated IT functionality to meet that funding stream's requirements. And so they're starting to open up to that discussion about whether it's braided funding or cost allocation or what. How do we more focus not just the policy, but that funding policy to really drive those outcomes that we're looking for.
Right. In fact, this came up when I was speaking with the current president of NASCIO, the CIO from Oklahoma, Bo. Bo told me that he's actually testified in Congress about the different and confusing regulations that are coming out of the federal government in terms of security policy. It's very difficult to serve various masters, and that's what it's come down to in that area. And it reminded me again of this whole issue with the federal funding of social service programs. It's an ongoing intergovernmental imbroglio, I guess, that we're going to have forever, because it's very difficult to talking bureaucrats, and they've done things this way, and they don't want to do it differently, and they don't care about the other funding stream. So it's a challenge. I'm sure it's still going on.
It is, but I think the efforts in data, that maybe we'll talk a little bit more later, really is trying to shift that focus. Instead of just looking at, are you delivering the program, to start to look at outcomes, right? To start to look at the things that really matter, the purpose of the program. Are we feeding more people? Are more people getting jobs? Those sorts of things. That's giving better feedback that we can provide back at the state level and at the federal level to say, this is what you really care about, and I can do that more effectively and take them proposals, right? So we don't have to wait for them necessarily.
Well, don't get me wrong. I know it makes sense. I know it makes sense. It always made sense. But it's, like I said, it's tough to turn the bureaucrats around that have done it one way all their lives. But hopefully that's changing, because you're right. It is interesting to talk about the data and how important it is. I can remember being in cabinet meetings back in the day where the governor would ask the head of HHS, said, how many folks in California does your agency serve? And you didn't know the answer. And that was just within one agency.
Right.
Speaking of agencies, let's talk about yours, because I find it fascinating how large it is. And we mentioned the 12 largest ones, but you've got some huge departments in there. Why don't you tell us a little bit about them?
Sure. I mean, really, the spectrum of everything you can think of under Health and Human Services. Department of Healthcare Services, as you said, the single state Medicaid agency, is just massive. The amount of funding, the amount of policy, the amount of work that they have to do on a daily basis is gargantuan. And then you've got Department of Social Services providing for all the programs, CalFresh, TANF, refugees, across the board, all conglomerated into those. Public health, handling a whole variety of issues. And as you can imagine, especially with someone like public health, most of what they do crosses over into healthcare. It's dealing with clients of social services, right? So you're constantly getting these crossover between programs. The other amazing thing about the Health and Human Services Agency is you've got these behemoths, just huge agencies, huge departments within the agency and their responsibilities. And then we've got Department of Aging, where literally we could probably fit the staff into this studio, not to tell people how big the studio is.
It's an intimate studio, we like your phrase.
And so you've got real different dynamics, both from a business, a user, an IT perspective, when you're dealing with those huge budgets, huge numbers of staff, huge number of recipients, to those smaller programs where you have people who have to take on 4 or 5 roles that would be separate positions in a larger department, but it's all consolidated into one person because that's what you do when you're in a small shop.
And interestingly enough, when I was looking into this for the show, or our crack research department, I should say, but the largest one is state hospitals, with over 10,000 employees in state hospitals. And talk about a job to do. I mean, talk about an agency no department that's always has its challenges just by the nature of the work. Yeah, it's huge. It's very, very large. And that kind of leads me to my next question. I kind of explained somewhat the origin of the AIO, the Agency Information Officer model, which has been adopted pretty much around the country by government agencies as well. And it's an interesting perspective, because why don't you describe what your job is as AIO and how you interface and work with the various department CIOs?
Sure. And what I will say is, across the country it varies. Even within California, the roles and functions of the AIOs and the different agencies varies depending on their portfolio, what their bandwidth is, what their secretary expects of them. At the very least, with our shop, coordination among the CIOs, trying to look at IT as an enterprise. And so what I'm really trying to bring to the role is that vision across the whole agency, that as we do things, we need to think about each other and no longer build our own functionality for our own business purposes and then leave it to business to figure out later on when they're going to need to know something, right? So regularly we have between healthcare services and social services and state hospitals the need to exchange data, the need to share information about what's going on with certain clients. During the wildfires that we had over this past year, there was a huge need to be able to cross-match what's going on with different departments' responsibilities in response to those fires, as well as you mentioned state hospitals and other departments with facilities that were impacted by those fires. And that's where you get to this, can we even look holistically across? And the way we've built things historically, it's not easy to do. And so we, as we look driving forward on projects and the way that we operate across those CIOs and their departments, we're now working as one team to have discussions about how do we do this in a more coordinated fashion where we can be out ahead. When business realizes a need, we're prepared to meet that need and not tell them that we need to go through a 2-year process to get them the system that they need to do that.
Okay. And in many respects, I think that HHS is the way it's organized, particularly from an information technology standpoint, adds another layer of complexity to the challenge of what you're trying to do. Why don't you talk about your role versus, say, the role of OSI and how that fits into managing IT projects and managing IT in general within HHS? And again, I'm glad you mentioned it. Every AIO kind of has a different portfolio, different responsibility, different authority probably, actually. I'm not sure how it's written down in SAM, but I certainly know in talking to your colleagues that there's many times that some feel they've got the ear of their chief executive and they can get things done, but others, it can be very challenging.
Yeah, it definitely varies. I appreciate
when
the
your
question.
budget is small and theirs is so large.
Right. So with OSI, it is very interesting in Health and Human Services. The Office of Systems Integration, for those who don't know, it's really a centralized expert shop at running IT projects. And it came about years ago because of the magnitude of some of these projects going on in Health and Human Services Agency, sometimes upward of $500 million on one IT system. And to staff up those sorts of resources and expertise in each department isn't feasible, it's not efficient, it's not effective. And so came Office of Systems Integration. They have, I think it's 9 right now, roughly 9 projects that they manage on behalf of their sponsor departments, primarily Department of Social Services and Department of Healthcare Services. And they run those on behalf of those sponsors, working very closely, obviously, because the business is still within those departments. But from the IT functionality, it's centralized there in the Office of Systems Integration. What's interesting is historically, the Chief Deputy Director of the Office of Systems Integration was also the agency chief information officer. And this created an interesting dynamic where the Office of Systems Integration has a subset of the IT portfolio of the agency that they're responsible for, but their chief deputy was also responsible for the entirety of the Health and Human Services portfolio.
Right.
And so I'm the first person in this role where they've actually split those apart. There's now a dedicated Chief Deputy Director for Office of Systems Integration, and I get to solely focus. Matt Schuler recently got appointed to that position. Congratulations to Matt.
And OSI is Calamaris?
Yes, Dan Calamaris came from CalWIN, one of the consortia systems for statewide automated welfare systems.
Yeah, we were talking about that, not unlike John Boulay.
Yes.
Boulay had a similar background with local government, county government.
And it makes a lot of sense. Counties, for all of Health and Human Services, are our key partner. Not just a stakeholder, but our partner in everything we do. They're the frontline folks.
Kind of good news and bad news sometimes.
I always consider it good news. It does present challenges. When you talk to states who are completely state operated and run, they don't have to deal with some of those dynamics with 58 different counties doing things somewhat differently. But in the long run, it provides us a lot of value because those people are on the front line and they give us the most valuable feedback about this is what it takes to actually provide these services. These who are these people on the street actually are that have those needs. They get that better than anyone. And they always are eager to be at the table helping us figure out how to do this right.
Sure. Interestingly enough, back when I was CIO, we had the Child Support Project, which was one of those major 6 or 7 $300, $400 million IT projects that basically I, as the new CIO, was supposed to corral and get, either fix or terminate, move on with things. And child support was one of the ones we had to terminate, and that was a county-based system, and the people in the county that were in charge of it were the district attorneys, elected officials. I mean, it was just a hornet's nest trying to get involved in these things, because child support issues were front-page news in all these local governments. So they consolidated, as you know, when they started the new project, and it's been a lot more successful than it was. So, but it isn't. Counties certainly have a major role. When I was in Massachusetts, counties didn't mean anything. They didn't have any role.
Right.
Here, it's totally different and totally critical, and it's interesting. It's interesting of how these are going to move forward in that role, and how as I see it, OSI back when it used to be the Health and Welfare Data Center. To be honest with you, Russ Bohart ran it. When these projects first ran into trouble, that's when they kind of set up the beginnings of OSI within Health and Welfare Data Center. He was in charge of managing those big projects. And then after he left and I left a few years later, then they started OSI, and it made sense. In fact, I always believe that Terry Takai, if she'd have stayed on here another few years, would have had OSI become an enterprise model as opposed to just a health and human services model.
Yeah, it's been discussed for many, many years. And, the OSI does such great work. There's always a lot of hesitation to make changes there, right? Lift it, shift it, move it. There's so many good things that they do. Let's not, upset the apple cart, so to speak. But we work, and especially now Dan is the director of OSI, works very closely with CDT. And obviously Amy Tong, with her history as the previous agency information officer for Health and Human Services, has a very thorough understanding of what's done there. And so we're constantly sharing lessons learned and best practices and how CDT can provide some of these services and help the state as a whole while still allowing OSI to focus on their primary mission.
So moving along right now to some of your current projects, as you say, that OSI has a half a dozen or maybe a couple more than that, but there's other ones as well. And I've always been confused sometimes over the fact that a number of social service related IT projects aren't really classified as IT projects and don't end up in the tracking system, that kind of thing. And I kind of think Medicare, if I'm not mistaken, Medi-Cal might be in that category. How does that work? The
MMIS system?
Well, any of the systems that are large, but they're not really considered an IT project. They're more of a non-IT project, if you will.
Typically, most of the big projects we do consider IT projects. They may not all be managed by OSI. Some of them are managed within the departments. You do end up with interesting things sometimes where you have an IT system built out, and then the functionality really becomes operational, whether it's a fiscal intermediary or just collecting claims or those sorts of business operations. And I think that's where you get into that gray area of, yes, you're maintaining an IT system, but you're really more doing the business function. And sometimes you bounce back and forth between where those are until you really get to a new point where you're modernizing, replacing, or doing major changes to that system.
So let's talk about where the SAWS projects are.
Yeah, so
as the statewide automated welfare system, as it was called years ago, and they Leader and was it CalWin and so on. I'll let you explain it.
Yeah, so at this point we have 3 different consortia system. The politics and history around how we got here are enough for 3 shows. But right now we have Leader, which is the automated welfare system for LA on its own because it's huge. Then you've got CalWin, which has 18 counties, and C4 with the remaining 39. And under the direction of the legislature from several years ago, they
and the federal government, if I'm not mistaken,
and especially now the federal government, they shifted to 2. And so right now they've already started the process of migrating the C4 counties, 39 counties, into the new LA system, which was just completed last year, called LRS. Leader Replacement System, because the old system was Leader.
Nice acronym.
Very creative in government. And so they started that process, and the Fed said, CalWin is pretty dated as well as a technology. We just paid for you to build LRS. And so we need you to start having that gap analysis of what those 18 counties are going to need to do to move on to that updated technology. And so right now they're going through that process. It's going to be phased, right? They're going to start with the C4 counties and move those in, but they're doing it right. They're planning ahead and saying, let's not do it for those 39 counties and then come back and say, okay, now what do those other 18 counties need? Because Cal One's a wholly different system and it operates very differently. So they're doing that all up front, doing that gap analysis to say, what's it going to take to get all 58 counties onto this one automated welfare system?
And can you describe a bit the procurement and the vendor involved in these processes? For example, right now, this gap analysis, is that, I think Accenture is involved in most of these systems integration area for those projects.
Sure. So, I mean, there's not definition about who or what it's going to be in the future, but the LRS design and build out was done by Accenture. C4 was built and operated by Accenture. And then the Cal One system is operated by DXC.
That's right.
I think that's what they're called now.
Will there be for this consolidation or integration, as it will be another procurement to select a systems integrator, or does it?
So I can't speak to the definitive procurement policy about how that's going to lay out, because it's going to be over a number of years. And realistically, looking at the way we are trending towards doing things now is, rather than say we need one vendor to build out this one statewide welfare system, we're going to be looking at what are the functionalities and components that go into that. Because there's a whole lot of ancillary functions. There's data centers, there's the actual the system itself for doing the eligibility determinations. And I think that they're going to be looking at those strategically as to what gets grouped together and what may becomes as separate procurements.
And obviously that begs the question about the new agile approach to development, as it were, for lack of a better term. It's become the de facto standard, I would think, in big projects for California. I mean, that's probably, I shouldn't really say that. It's relatively new, and obviously one of your other projects, the Child Welfare Digital Services, that's a big part of this whole new effort, right?
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, CWS Cares, as we call it now, is full bore in agile development, following the methodology and moving forward to deliver quickly, but strategically, and move that effort forward. And that was a very strategic decision to really get out ahead of that and demonstrate that it can function for a large-scale project. What I like to tell people is that I don't call agile the de facto for any project. I've had these discussions in the past about which procurement methodology you use, and now with Agile coming through, the development methodology that you're going to use. You really have to look at your project. What is it that you need? What's the most important features and factors? How much risk aversion do you have, right? And look at those tools that you have available and determine what's the right way to do it for this particular project. Sometimes that will be full-scale Agile development and procurement. Sometimes when I hear people talk about Agile, what they're really talking about is modular development. They want to be able to chunk it out. And that lends itself to Agile, but it doesn't have to be.
Sure.
And so I talk about people need to look at that. I do definitely stand behind modular development, both because you can get some functionality out in a quicker manner, whether it's Agile or some other development methodology, but also because it enables a much more integrated enterprise environment, like I was talking about earlier, where if you're going to build a standalone functionality, that now becomes a service that when I have another department or another CIO come forward with a need, I can have a service that they can consume, as opposed to it being wrapped up tightly within a different environment, which made it much more difficult in the past to have those discussions about sharing and leveraging.
Sounds good to me. I'll sign up.
Sweet.
I always get confused, though, on the child. We talked about the child CWDS, but there's also several other portions or segments of CWS procurements, or projects, I should say. I want to talk a little bit about those. I think there's the new system, CWS new system. Is that the same? That's not the same as the CARES.
That was the previous iteration. So it's gone through a whole lot of names. It's gone through literally a decade of trials and tribulations to figure out how they were going to move forward. So CWS Web, CWS new system, they're all just a part of the journey to get to this current CWDS or CWS CARES. So they're not separate builds or separate systems. It's just different stages along the way in getting to where we're at now.
And I noticed that Public Health has a WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children, $100 million plus. Is that what stage is that? Is that an older project, or is it relatively new?
It's relatively new, and what we see there is it's a smaller program than CalFresh. but they're both focused on food needs for the public, right? And with CalFresh, they moved away from food stamps, right? Both physically and as a term. With WIC, it's still very paper-based, right? Essentially coupons you have to go into the store with, and what they said is, we need to modernize. We need to get to that point where we have an EBT card where it's a much more user-friendly process. So that's what they're going through the process now, is getting onto modern technology that can facilitate those benefits for the user.
I always have a little story about WIC, the WIC process. When I was a CIO in Massachusetts, I hadn't been on the job more than a couple months, and I got one morning this gentleman came into my office, and he was in charge of the mail room. The CIO of California, I was in charge of all the mail that came in, and I said, what did I miss a meeting or something? But I was responsible for all the mail, and it was coordinated out of a former mental health facility in Western Massachusetts. And this guy comes to my office and says, I got some bad news. I said, what? And he said, well, you know, we do the mailing for the Women, Infants, and Children's eligibility system, and we send it out to all the recipients, and somehow the labels got mixed up when we sent the eligibility, the application forms for concealed carry to all the Women, Infants, and Children programs. Oh God, we laugh about it now, but it was a big deal then. Of course, it made the papers the next day.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure if that happened in my first few months, I wouldn't be on the show right now.
Well, anyway, we got through that with a chuckle in the end. But it's a critically important program, and it's another one of those. You know, you say 6 or 8. There's probably a dozen or more programs, eligibility programs that folks are entitled to or allowed for, and that's certainly one of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You know, when I was going through this thing, just another side, and I was looking at health-related programs. The correctional health care services, okay, part of the Department of Corrections and not part of the Department of Corrections. So we'll get Clark Kelso. Clark Kelso's shop. They have a electronic health record system project. You know what the budget is?
I do not.
$406 million for medical records for prisoners.
Yep.
$406 million, almost $500 million.
You know what they were doing before they were getting that system going? They had the prisoners carry their files with them on the bus when they transferred.
Well, for $406 million, they ought to give them my limousine, huh? Holy cow. Anyway, let's talk about your new projects. We've talked about SAWS, we talked about Agile, we talked about CAMUS. Where is CAMUS, by the way? That's another one that's...
It's a huge project. It's been a long...
And it is the Medi-Cal Management Information System.
Correct.
Right? That was the old name. The CA up front, is that the new project or the existing
yeah, I
one?
mean, it gets very confusing because it's essentially the same thing. MMIS as a whole is a large enterprise of functionalities that are required by the federal government.
Okay.
CAMUS is defining the IT project portion of modernizing a certain subset of those.
Okay.
So it's moving forward through the budget and request for approval processes right now. And like I said, it's looking at kind of breaking those functionalities up so that they can define the focus of a certain functionality and get that delivered in a shorter term than trying to just do this whole thing all at once.
Now, is that the one that they put out an RFP, they pulled it? Is that CAMUS?
So they had a vendor on board long before my time, and there was a shift in directions and a settlement between the vendor and the state.
But there hasn't been a new RFP for that?
So there has been for several of the smaller portions that they've already started, and now they're working to ramp up the next bigger modules.
So is this again looking like CWDS in terms of the agile methodology? Is that why it's been broken up, or is this the breaking it up, if you will, is just a strategy, and it still could go in either direction, I guess is what you're saying.
So technically it could go in either direction. I would say that they're
they're
definitely looking at Agile, but I wouldn't say that I could definitively state like I can with CWDS that there's this methodology that I can ascribe to the effort.
Yeah, we've been looking forward to getting somebody from CWDS on the program for some time. We got him in the audience now, right? With the intrepid Bill Maley and Peter Kelly, who's used to hail from over there.
Yeah.
It is. I describe that project as part Lollapalooza, part Silicon Valley, and Burning Man probably, because it's certainly an interesting. And I love to. I've been over to see a couple of their speakers on data data analytics, looking at the whole artificial intelligence, how to predict whether a case should be referred to for social work. It's very interesting stuff. Fraught with danger, but very interesting, no question about it. Talk about new projects. I went through the PAL, the Project
approval life cycle.
Approval life cycle, which basically replaced the old feasibility study reports, the case study for justifying an IT project.
Yep.
It's also called Stargate.
Stagegate.
Stagegate.
Yep.
Stagegate.
I like Stargate better.
I do too. I do too. But is it either one or?
It's either one. The project approval life cycle is really what it's about, and within the project approval life cycle, there are these stage gates that you must go through and get approved to demonstrate that you're doing the appropriate planning for the project.
All I hear is about it's it's taking too long. I don't hear a lot of complaints about the process in terms of the integrity of the system, the due diligence required. But I guess like everything else, everybody wants something done yesterday.
Correct.
As opposed to down the road.
Yeah, I mean, what I will say is good project planning takes time. How much time is the right amount of time? That's always the difficult question. When do you start running, right, and stop looking ahead? But what I will say is that I think Amy Tong, State CIO, has done a great job instilling the culture at CDT of never doing process over form, right? Don't say, you can't move forward because I don't have this document yet if you don't even think that document adds value. Step back, look at what really gets us to successful projects that meet the business need, and if that requires some flexibility, she's really tried to instill that culture, and I very much appreciate that.
That's a good guidepost. I remember when I first came on board here, the feasibility study reports, we got about between 100 and 150 every year from different departments justifying why there should be new spending.
Yep.
And I asked the staff that was reviewing these things, I say, well, of those you get, how many do you disapprove? And they said none. I said, well, what are you looking at them for then? If you're not going to disapprove any of them, it's a long story, but it was a very difficult, tortuous process years ago, and it still is tortuous and torturous, I should say, because of just the way it is. Everybody wants it done right away. They want to get their money, and it's a process that I'm still. Between the Department of Finance and the California Department of Technology, they're still like this in terms of agreeing about how projects should be funded. I was also of the opinion it should be a dollar amount that how much is being spent on IT in your department on new projects, and that's your baseline. You either get a little more next year or a little less. But they didn't seem to care about that. So you can put in 150 FSRs or PALs or whatever you want, and you think by the odds of numbers alone, you'll get you'll get what you want funded. So it's a challenge. One of the areas of responsibility you had over at DSS, and also I assume at HHS, is this the need to integrate all healthcare. Is that something similar to what you talked about? Is that the same thing as horizontal integration?
Horizontal integration,
okay,
exactly,
thing.
yeah.
Well, let's move on to another topic. Innovation is a big one, and you have a new Office of Innovation that I'd like to hear more about. I know there's also, is there an innovation officer in the state of California in CDT? I don't think there is, or is there?
I don't know if they've given anyone that direct title. I'm honestly not sure of what Scott Gregory's title is there, but he takes on some of this effort in terms of looking at ways to provide services that people can leverage, really get out in front of things. So they have some of that role. I'm not sure what title they've put on it. But at HHS, under Secretary Dooley and Under Secretary Mike Wilkening, they've really put a focus over the last several years on a culture of innovation. And, putting their money where their mouth is, created this department of, this Office of Innovation, hired Cheney Emenovan, who's now the director and on board. And he is going to have dedicated staff working with him from across the agency who are going to take on efforts, because we recognize that you can talk about the culture, right? But people are swamped with their day-to-day lives, right? And when you have keeping the lights on up against trying to come up with innovative solutions, keeping the lights on always wins. So having dedicated staff who are focusing on this to really kickstart it. And I really like the way Shaney talks about it, innovation, because everyone, what is innovation? He talks about it as problem definition. Really get people to identify what's your real pain point that needs to be worked on, and go through a very deliberative process of, okay, how can we address that problem? And push to the side the history, push to the side all the constraints that you think are there, because a lot of times you're just doing it because that's how you thought it had to be done. Getting that out of the way and allowing people to think clearly and concisely about ways to get real benefit. And we've already seen the value over the last couple of years in the agency, and now with Shaney there with a dedicated team, I think it's really going to take off.
And Shaney, now where did is it a man or a woman?
Man.
Where did he come from?
He came from federal government, worked there for a dozen some odd years, maybe longer. I'm probably getting that wrong.
He's within your HHS agency? Or?
Yeah, so
Okay.
he and his team sit with me in the office of the agency information officer, but work directly with the undersecretaries. This is a top priority, kind of getting this culture instilled.
We only have a few more minutes. Vendors, how do you deal with vendors?
Should I be? Your
salary's paid by vendors. Remember that.
My salary is paid by the public, including vendors. My perspective, maybe because I came from CDT, but when I've worked with other business folks, there's this apprehension, this fear of talking to vendors that comes from that procurement world, right? We're like, oh, no, you need to separate. For me, vendors are folks who get to dedicate some of the best skilled people in the field to dealing with these problems across the nation. They've got solutions to share with us.
So
right?
How do they approach you?
Every way you can think of.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. I felt the same way. And certainly TechLeader TV has had its challenges sometimes getting folks to sit in that chair.
Sure.
Sometimes, like I said, nobody's gotten fired, but still there's that hesitation sometimes to say the wrong thing or the wrong word.
I hope to keep that streak running.
That's right. That's my job. Although we do like scoops here. We've only a minute or two left. We never should go through this without talking about security.
Sure.
And I mentioned that you oversee security policies. Is that true? Short answer here. Is that something you're involved in as well?
Absolutely, for coordinating the agency. And it's very interesting the work that Amy's been doing at the state level.
Is there an agency?
Agency
officer?
Information Security Officer.
Didn't
yes.
know that.
Yes.
Didn't know that.
Kind of same role as coordinating the ISOs within each of the departments.
Or separate?
In my shop.
Okay.
Yeah, reporting directly to me.
Okay.
But now under Amy's leadership, there's really a lot more coordination with them at the state level to say, what protection can the state be responsible for and ease that burden for each of the agencies? What's the agency's role to help coordinate the departments? And then what's that really tactical level of what the departments need to make sure that they're doing to keep us protected?
Well, good. I'm glad we got a chance to bring up security. I'd be amiss. I went through the entire 10,000-page budget, and the cybersecurity is not Alt-F, not there. Can you imagine that? Anyway, what was the other thing I wanted to talk to you about? Oh, May Revise. Any big changes coming up in May Revise?
Well,
for
I
HHS?
can't answer that, John.
When will May Revise? Is it due?
What day is today?
Is it coming early May usually, or?
It's early May, mid-May, so it'll be soon.
Yeah, soon. That's good to hear. Well, that concludes our program today. I want to thank everybody for watching. You've been a great guest. We hope to probe on some of the more provocative issues you've raised during our sponsors' lunch afterwards. We always appreciate you folks watching. We love to have recommendations on topics and guests. Be sure to tune in. I also want to make mention to our wonderful hosts here at Access Sacramento, the beautiful new stage they set up for us. I hope it'll do something to improve our programming as well, but I'll rely on your feedback for the answer to that. I do know that I want to congratulate Marcy Kabadi. She is the Agency Information Officer. That's all we're talking about is AIOs today. She's Agency Information Officer for the Department of Transportation and was recognized by State Scoop as an State Executive CIO of the Year, along with some of her other colleagues. Finally, look forward to some shows coming ahead. In fact, Marcy, we're in touch with her to come on the show, along with her CIO from Caltrans, George Akiyama. Great shows planned. Still looking at Amazon trips coming up. And don't forget our drone symposium. More information on that about an event sometime at the end of the summer. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Good job.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, very good job.